Welcome to this new episode brought to you by Volta 15, your #1 top 15 list maker. Some of the world's most dangerous criminals weren't just caught once. They were caught over and over, yet still walked free. Police questioned them, courts released them, and every time more victims followed. Today we're counting down the 15 most shocking cases of criminals who committed multiple crimes without ever facing the punishment they truly deserved. Number 15. Issei Sagawa, Japan, France. In the summer of 1981, Paris police discovered a man trying to dump two heavy suitcases into a park. Inside were the remains of a young Dutch student named René Hartevelt. The man was Issei Sagawa, a Japanese graduate student who had invited her to his apartment for dinner. After shooting her, he dismembered her body and ate parts of the flesh before attempting to dispose of what was left. His arrest should have led to life in prison, but the French court ruled him legally insane and placed him in a psychiatric hospital. Just 5 years later, Sagawa was transferred back to Japan. There, doctors examined him again and declared him mentally fit. Because the French case had been dropped, Japanese courts had no legal way to retry him. Instead of a prison cell, Sagawa stepped into freedom and even turned his crime into a twisted kind of fame, publishing books and appearing on talk shows as if he had never been a killer at all. Number 14. Charles Ng, Hong Kong and USA. In the early 1980s, Charles Ng fled Hong Kong for the United States after facing theft and fraud charges. There he met Leonard Lake, and together they began one of the most horrifying crime sprees in California history. The pair kidnapped, tortured, and murdered victims at a remote cabin. But before those crimes came to light, Ng had already built a pattern of avoiding serious punishment. Arrested multiple times for shoplifting and firearms violations, he was often released or given light sentences. When military authorities caught him for weapons theft during his time in the Marines, he escaped custody and slipped back into civilian life. Even after police grew suspicious of Lake and Ng, delays in warrants and evidence collection gave them more time. It wasn't until 1985, after Lake committed suicide during questioning, that Ng was finally tied to the murders. But even then, the system faltered. He fled to Canada, where he fought extradition for 6 years. Legal battles and appeals dragged on so long that many feared he might never face trial in the U.S. Only in 1999, after years of delays and millions in legal costs, was he finally convicted. For nearly 2 decades, Charles Ng used loopholes, technicalities, and jurisdiction battles to keep the justice system at bay while families of his victims waited for answers. Number 13. Ed Gein, USA. In the quiet farming town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein was known as the strange but harmless neighbor who kept to himself after the death of his mother. What no one realized was that, late at night, Gein was digging up freshly buried corpses, bringing them home, and turning their remains into furniture, clothing, and trophies. Despite his bizarre behavior, police never looked closely. He had been arrested before for minor offenses, but the authorities saw him more as an eccentric loner than a threat. That illusion shattered in 1957 when hardware store owner Bernice Warden vanished. Blood was found in her shop, leading officers to Gein's farmhouse. Inside, they uncovered Warden's body, along with a gruesome collection of skulls, masks made from human skin, and body parts preserved in jars. It became clear that Gein had been committing crimes for years under the noses of local law enforcement. The justice system's response was startlingly uneven. Declared legally insane, he was committed to a mental institution instead of prison. There, he lived out his days quietly, never facing the punishment one might expect for such horrific acts. The same man who had terrorized his community in secret was treated as a patient rather than a criminal, showing just how easily the system could look away until it was too late. Number 12. Richard Speck, USA. On the night of July 13, 1966, Chicago nurse Corazon Amaral hid under a bed while she listened to the screams of her fellow roommates being murdered one by one. The intruder was Richard Speck, a drifter who bound, raped, and killed 8 student nurses in a single night. The massacre shocked America. But it wasn't the first time Speck had crossed paths with the law. For years, his record showed burglary, forgery, assault, and public drunkenness. He was arrested again and again, but judges dismissed charges, handed down probation, or gave him only short jail terms. Even when he stabbed a man in a bar fight, he avoided serious punishment. Police called him violent, unpredictable, and dangerous, but none of it stopped him from walking free. By the time he entered that Chicago townhouse, Speck had already been given more chances than most criminals ever receive. The system's failure to keep him locked up made the horror of that night possible. And when the trial finally came, he was sentenced to death, only for the ruling to be overturned on a technicality. His sentence was reduced to life in prison, where he lived for decades. The memory of those 8 murdered nurses standing as proof of how many times he should have been stopped before it ever happened. Number 11. Randy Kraft, USA. For more than a decade, men disappeared along the highways of California and Oregon, their bodies turning up in ravines, ditches, or hidden under brush. The killer was Randy Kraft, later nicknamed the Scorecard Killer, for the cryptic list of victims police would eventually find in his car. But before investigators closed in, Kraft lived an ordinary life, working as a computer programmer, volunteering in politics, and blending easily into his community. Kraft had brushes with the law long before his arrest in 1983. In the early 1970s, police stopped him in his car with a young man passed out beside him. The victim later died, but prosecutors couldn't build a strong enough case, and Kraft walked free. Similar encounters followed. Victims found bound or drugged, with Kraft nearby or linked to the scene, yet each time the evidence fell just short of securing a conviction. The justice system's hesitation gave Kraft room to continue. By the time he was finally arrested, after officers discovered a strangled Marine in his car during a traffic stop, investigators tied him to more than 60 murders, though he was convicted of 16. For years, a combination of weak evidence, legal caution, and missed opportunities kept Kraft in plain sight, free to keep killing while his true crimes remained hidden. Number 10. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, Canada. In the early 1990s, Canada was shaken by the crimes of Paul Bernardo and his then-wife, Karla Homolka. While Bernardo was already suspected in a series of assaults, it was only after investigators closed in that Homolka struck a controversial deal with prosecutors. She portrayed herself as a victim, claiming Bernardo controlled her actions. The courts accepted her version of events, and in exchange for testifying against Bernardo, she received a sentence of just 12 years. At the time, the public was told she had been a reluctant participant, but later, when videotapes surfaced, they painted a different picture, showing that Homolka had been far more involved than she admitted. By then, it was too late. The plea bargain was binding, and nothing could be done to lengthen her sentence. While Bernardo was eventually sentenced to life in prison, Homolka served her short term and walked free. Today, she lives under a new identity, her case still one of Canada's most debated examples of a justice system failure. Number 9. Jack Unterweger, Austria. In 1974, Austrian drifter Jack Unterweger strangled an 18-year-old girl with her own bra. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Most assumed that was the end of his story. But behind bars, Unterweger reinvented himself. He began writing poems, short stories, and plays that caught the attention of Austria's literary elite. Supporters claim prison had transformed him into a brilliant artist and a model of rehabilitation. After just 15 years fueled by public campaigns and glowing media attention, Unterweger was released early. He was welcomed back into society as proof that even killers could change. But almost immediately, sex workers began disappearing across Europe. Victims were found strangled with their own bras, the same method Unterweger had used before. Even as suspicions mounted, Unterweger was celebrated as a cultural figure. He gave interviews on television, attended literary events, and even worked as a journalist covering crime. Shockingly, he sometimes reported on the very murders he was committing. It wasn't until 1992, when international police finally connected the cases, that Unterweger was arrested again. By then, at least 11 women had been killed during the years society had treated him as a redeemed man. Number 8. Albert Fish, USA. In the early 1900s, Albert Fish presented himself as a frail, quiet old man, earning the trust of families across New York. Behind that harmless exterior, however, lurked one of America's most sadistic killers. He preyed on children, luring them away with promises of food or work, and subjected them to unthinkable torture before murdering them. Fish had already been in and out of trouble with the law for years. He was arrested multiple times for theft, threatening letters, and even violent assaults, yet each time he was released after short stints or dismissed charges. Authorities saw him as eccentric and unstable, but not as a dangerous predator. His bizarre behavior was brushed aside as harmless madness, even when it should have raised every alarm. In 1928, he abducted 10-year-old Grace Budd after convincing her family he was offering her a job. For years, police failed to connect him to her disappearance, despite his long criminal history. It wasn't until Fish sent a chilling letter to the Budd family, describing in detail how he had killed and eaten their daughter, that detectives finally closed in. Even then, he almost escaped again, running from arresting officers before being caught. By the time Albert Fish was executed in 1936, it was clear that he had lived most of his life slipping through the justice system, free to keep committing crimes while warnings were ignored. Number 7. Charles Cullen, USA. For 16 years, patients in hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania died quietly under the care of Nurse Charles Cullen. Families were told their loved ones had suffered sudden heart failures or medical complications, but in reality, Cullen was secretly injecting them with lethal doses of drugs. He later admitted to killing more than 40 patients, though investigators believe the true number may be far higher. What makes Cullen's case extraordinary isn't just the scale of his crimes, but how easily he moved from hospital to hospital. Administrators often suspected him when deaths spiked under his watch. Colleagues raised concerns, and some even caught him tampering with IV bags. Yet instead of reporting him to police, hospitals quietly asked him to resign, fearing lawsuits and scandal. Each time, Cullen simply applied elsewhere and was hired again. This cycle repeated for years, leaving a trail of preventable deaths. When he was finally arrested in 2003, the horror became clear. Dozens of patients had lost their lives because institutions chose to protect their reputations rather than confront a killer. Cullen himself admitted he expected to be caught much earlier, but the system's silence had given him freedom to keep killing. Number 6. Alphonse Capone, USA. In Prohibition-era Chicago, Al Capone built an empire of speakeasies, bootlegging routes, and bribes that reached deep into the city's police force and political offices. Everyone knew he was behind the violence. Gang wars, bombings, and the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre that left 7 men riddled with bullets in 1929. Witnesses were intimidated or killed, and juries refused to convict. Capone was arrested dozens of times, charged with everything from assault to murder. Yet the cases always collapsed. Judges dismissed evidence, jurors were bribed, and prosecutors backed off under pressure. On the streets, he walked as a celebrity gangster, handing out food to the poor while his men gunned down rivals in broad daylight. The system that should have stopped him seemed powerless against his wealth and influence. In the end, the only charge that stuck was tax evasion. In 1931, Capone was finally convicted, not for his murders or his empire of crime, but for failing to pay the IRS. He served just 7 years before being released for health reasons. His reign of terror cut short not by justice, but by accounting paperwork. Number 5. Edmund Kemper, USA. At just 15 years old, Edmund Kemper picked up a rifle and killed his grandparents. Declared deeply disturbed, he was sent to a state mental hospital where doctors diagnosed him as a sociopath. But Kemper was charming and intelligent, and over the years he convinced psychiatrists that he had changed. In 1969, he was released on parole into the care of his mother, despite warnings from some staff that he remained dangerous. What followed was a series of brutal murders that would make Kemper one of America's most infamous killers. He picked up female hitchhikers, strangled or shot them, and dismembered their bodies, often returning home to his mother's house with trophies hidden in his car. Even as reports of missing women piled up in California, police overlooked him. Kemper himself once sat across from detectives in a bar, discussing the case of the mysterious co-ed killer without anyone suspecting he was the man they were hunting. In 1973, after killing his mother and her friend, Kemper finally called the police and confessed. Only then did authorities realize that the same man they had once declared rehabilitated had murdered at least 8 more women. The system that had released him early had placed a proven killer back into society with devastating consequences. Number 4, Henry Lee Lucas, USA. When police first arrested Henry Lee Lucas in 1983, it was for the murder of his elderly landlord. What followed stunned investigators. Lucas began confessing to killing not just one person, but hundreds across the United States. He spoke casually of strangling hitchhikers, stabbing strangers, and leaving bodies scattered from Texas to Michigan. While the true number of his victims remains debated, authorities agree he killed far more than the system ever stopped him from doing. Lucas's path to that point was paved with missed chances. Decades earlier, he had already served time for killing his mother, but was released after only 10 years due to overcrowding. Afterward, he drifted through towns, picked up for crimes like burglary, theft, and assault. Each time, he was either paroled or given a short sentence. At one point, a judge even described him as someone who didn't pose a continued threat. The reality was far darker. Lucas kept murdering while the justice system let him slip through cracks caused by weak sentencing and poor coordination between states. By the time Texas Rangers finally pieced together his trail, dozens of families had lost loved ones to a man who had been free when he never should have been. We are now moving on to the top 3 of the list. If you have made it this far, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Vault of 15. Number 3. DeCarlos Brown, USA. For years, DeCarlos Brown built a reputation as a career criminal, cycling through the courts with charges that ranged from drug trafficking to armed robbery and assault. Police in multiple states knew his name. He was arrested again and again, often caught with evidence linking him directly to the crimes. Yet somehow, Brown rarely faced more than short jail terms or probation. Prosecutors leaned on plea deals to move cases quickly through crowded dockets. Judges cited prison overcrowding when handing down lighter sentences. In some instances, charges were dismissed altogether when witnesses failed to appear or paperwork was mishandled. Each time, Brown returned to the streets, and each time, new crimes followed. He became a symbol of a broken cycle, a man whose long list of offenses should have kept him locked away, but instead highlighted how leniency, legal shortcuts, and overburdened courts can allow a repeat offender to thrive. By the time law enforcement began to recognize the full scope of his record, Brown had already spent years treating the justice system not as a threat, but as an obstacle he had learned to step around. Number 2. Rodney Alcala, USA. To neighbors and friends in the 1970s, Rodney Alcala was a charming photographer with a winning smile. He even sat confidently on national television as a contestant on The Dating Game. But behind the facade, Alcala was hunting victims, luring women and children with promises of modeling sessions, then assaulting and murdering them. Police had more than one chance to stop him. In 1968, he kidnapped and raped an 8-year-old girl in Los Angeles. The crime should have kept him in prison for decades, yet he served barely 2 years before being paroled. Within months, he attacked another child, was arrested, and again released early. Instead of locking him away, the courts gave him freedom. Even while on the FBI's most wanted list, Alcala slipped into New York under a false identity, enrolled in film school, and continued to prey on the vulnerable. Detectives questioned him in connection with a missing girl, but released him when evidence felt thin. By the time he was finally arrested in 1979, investigators realized he had left a trail of victims across multiple states. Murders that could have been prevented if earlier convictions had been treated with the severity they deserved. Number 1. Kenneth Bianchi, USA. In the late 1970s, Los Angeles was haunted by the killings of young women whose bodies were found on hillsides across the city. The press dubbed the case the work of the Hillside Strangler. In reality, it was two men, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Buono, who lured women with promises of modeling jobs before binding, torturing, and murdering them. What makes Bianchi's story especially chilling is how often he evaded the system's grip. Before the murders, he had already been in trouble for theft, fraud, and impersonating a psychologist. Each time, charges were dropped or reduced, allowing him to drift between jobs and cities without serious punishment. Even when he and Buono were questioned early in the investigation, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him, and he was released. Bianchi eventually moved to Washington State, where his behavior turned violent again. It was only after killing two more women there that police finally tied him back to the Los Angeles murders. By then, at least 10 women had already died. For years, Kenneth Bianchi walked free not because he was invisible, but because every earlier red flag had been ignored or brushed aside until the death toll made him impossible to overlook. We hope you found this countdown as unsettling as we did. These stories remind us that sometimes it isn't just the criminals who are dangerous, it's the cracks in the system that let them walk free. Thank you for watching Vault of 15, your number one top 15 list maker. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time for another deep dive into the darkest corners of history. And remember, the truth is in the list.